It began with a sighting that felt almost too strange to be real. A quiet luxury resort, far from paparazzi hotspots, suddenly became the center of a rumor that spread faster than anyone expected. Jamie Dornan had reportedly been seen there, with Dakota Johnson. But that alone wasn't what shocked people. What truly sent the internet into chaos was the claim that his wife and children were there too, all in the same place, at the same time. At first, it sounded like a misunderstanding, the kind of story that appears online and disappears just as quickly. But then more details started to surface, and suddenly it didn't feel so easy to dismiss. A guest at the resort claimed they spotted the group near a private dining area, describing what looked like a relaxed, almost casual interaction. Another source mentioned seeing them walking in close proximity, not as strangers, but not exactly as a typical group either. The descriptions were vague, but that only made them more intriguing, leaving just enough room for speculation to take over. The timing of the rumor made it even more explosive. Ever since 50 Shades of Grey turned both actors into global names, fans have been obsessed with the idea that their connection went beyond the screen. Every glance, every interview, every shared moment had been analyzed endlessly, with many convinced there was always something more beneath the surface. So when this supposed trip came to light, it didn't just feel like a coincidence, it felt like confirmation of something people had suspected for years. Social media quickly split into two opposing camps. One side believed this was undeniable proof of a hidden relationship, something that had quietly existed behind carefully controlled public images. They pointed to the unusual nature of the situation. Why would a man travel with his co-star and his family at the same time unless there was a deeper connection binding them all together? The other side pushed back, arguing that the story lacked concrete evidence and was likely exaggerated, another case of the internet connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. But the more people debated, the more the story evolved. Old interviews resurfaced, moments where Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson appeared unusually comfortable with each other were suddenly reinterpreted as clues. A laugh that once seemed harmless was now labeled too familiar, a shared joke now seen as something more intimate. It was as if the past had been rewritten to fit the present narrative, each detail reshaped to support the idea that something had been hidden in plain sight all along. Media outlets didn't hesitate to amplify the tension. Headlines leaned into the ambiguity, carefully choosing words that suggested drama without confirming anything outright. Phrases like unexpected reunion and surprising company began to circulate, pulling more attention toward the story. Even the lack of official statements became part of the intrigue, with silence being interpreted as either denial or quiet confirmation, depending on who you asked. Then came the detail that pushed everything to another level. One report suggested that the group wasn't just coincidentally at the same location, they were allegedly staying within the same private section of the resort. That single claim, unverified but repeated enough times, transformed the rumor into something far more provocative. Suddenly, it wasn't just about being in the same place, it was about sharing space, sharing time, existing within the same carefully controlled environment. And yet, for all the noise, there was something oddly inconsistent about the story. The descriptions never quite aligned, the timelines didn't perfectly match, and the sources remained frustratingly anonymous. It created a strange tension between what people wanted to believe and what could actually be proven. Still, that uncertainty didn't slow the spread, it fueled it, allowing each person to fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. As the speculation reached its peak, one thing became clear: the narrative had already taken on a life of its own. Whether the trip happened exactly as described or not almost stopped mattering, because the idea behind it was too compelling to ignore. The possibility of something hidden, something unconventional, something that blurred the lines between personal and professional, it was exactly the kind of story people couldn't look away from. But buried beneath all the rumors, reposts, and dramatic interpretations was a crucial detail that very few people stopped to question. A detail that didn't fit the scandal, didn't support the theory of secrecy, and quietly challenged everything the internet thought it had uncovered. And once that detail comes into focus, the entire story begins to look very different. What almost everyone overlooked in the rush to turn the story into a scandal was a simple but critical question: what if nothing about this situation was hidden at all? The idea that Jamie Dornan would openly travel with Dakota Johnson while his wife and children were present doesn't just challenge the rumor, it quietly dismantles it. Because if there were anything inappropriate or secretive happening, the last thing anyone would do is place it in full view of family, in a shared environment where nothing could be concealed. This is where the narrative begins to shift, not dramatically, but logically. In an industry where secrecy often fuels real scandals, transparency tends to signal the opposite. The presence of family changes the entire context of the situation, turning what seems suspicious into something far more ordinary. It suggests not a hidden relationship, but a level of comfort and trust that only exists when boundaries are clearly understood and respected. Looking closer, the idea of actors maintaining connections outside of work is far less unusual than people assume. After years of working together on a project as intense as 50 Shades of Grey, it's natural that a certain level of familiarity remains. But familiarity doesn't automatically translate into romance or secrecy. It can just as easily mean mutual respect, shared experience, and a professional bond that extends beyond the set without crossing personal lines. In fact, many actors intentionally normalize these relationships to prevent exactly the kind of speculation that ended up happening here. What also stands out is how selectively the information was interpreted. The same details that were used to build a narrative of suspicion could just as easily support the opposite conclusion. A shared location becomes coincidence, proximity becomes logistics, and casual interaction becomes nothing more than polite acknowledgement. The difference lies not in the facts themselves, but in how they are framed, and in this case, they were framed through a lens that expected drama from the very beginning. There's also a deeper pattern at play, one that goes beyond this specific situation. Audiences often struggle to accept that two actors with strong on-screen chemistry can exist in a completely normal, grounded dynamic off-screen. The more convincing the performance, the harder it becomes to separate fiction from reality. So when a moment like this appears, ambiguous, incomplete, open to interpretation, it becomes a blank canvas for assumptions, shaped more by expectation than evidence. And yet, the quiet reality behind it all is far less sensational, but arguably more telling. By allowing their personal and professional worlds to overlap in a visible, uncomplicated way, both Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson are, in a sense, rejecting the very narrative people tried to impose on them. They're showing that it's possible to share space without sharing secrets, to maintain a connection without turning it into something it isn't. It's a kind of normalcy that feels almost unfamiliar in a culture that constantly looks for hidden meaning. The real twist, then, isn't that something shocking happened, it's that nothing did. What felt like a mystery was actually a projection, built from years of speculation and a desire to find more than what was ever there. And once that realization sets in, the entire story loses its edge, revealing something much simpler beneath the noise. Which leads to a final thought that's harder to ignore than any rumor. If a completely ordinary situation can be transformed into a global talking point just because it involves two familiar faces, how many other stories are we believing? Not because they're true, but because they fit the version of reality we expect to see. Which leads to a final thought that's harder to ignore than any rumor. If a completely ordinary situation can be transformed into a global talking point just because it involves two familiar faces, how many other stories are we believing not because they're true, but because they fit the version of reality we expect to see?